Lord, that we may carry out your holy and true command. Our Lady, seat of wisdom, pray for us. St. Patrick, pray for us. Blessed Columba Marmion, pray for us. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Yeah, the kingship of Christ, the idea of the social kingship of Christ is a devotional, is an attempt by Pope Pius XI in 1925 to give a devotional expression to the Catholic social teaching, particularly of his predecessor Leo XIII, who reigned from 1878 to 1903. And you have to understand what he did in that pontificate in order to understand what Pius XI intended by instituting the feast of the Kingship of Christ on the last Sunday in October, as it was originally instituted. So it's replaced the Sunday that would have occurred liturgically on that day, which of course changed every year because it would depend what Sunday was the last Sunday in October, which one got bumped. To give it, so before one can explain the opposition to the doctrine, it's necessary to explain roughly what the doctrine is, when it arose, and why it's expressed in when the practice of referring to it as the social kingship of Christ arose. Okay, so broadly, the history of the church falls into three periods. There is Antiquity, the period, for our purposes, obviously it's older than the Incarnation, the period known as Antiquity, but from ecclesiastical purposes, it goes from the Incarnation, probably 4 BC, until the definitive rupture, well, I suppose definitive rupture of East and West in terms of their worldview, due to the collapse of the Roman Empire in the East under the threat of Islamic invasion, and in the West because of the Germanic invasions. So roughly the 8th century would be the very latest you could possibly describe anything as constituting antiquity, and really it starts to dissipate from the 5th century onwards. Okay, so that's our first period, the period of the Roman Empire. So for a quarter of the history of the church, 500 years, almost everybody, not everybody, but almost everybody who was a Christian numerically lived inside the Roman Empire. There were, of course, some Christians in China and India and the Persian Empire, but the vast majority of Christians during that period lived in the Roman Empire, and people who were members, as it were, of Western civilization were almost convertible with citizens of the Roman Empire during that period, or slaves living in the Roman Empire. The second period is the Middle Ages, right? That was originally invented as a term, an insult, in order to describe a boring period between the glories of pagan antiquity and the glories of neo-pagan Renaissance modernity, right, by early figures in the Renaissance. But it's actually quite a helpful term, and it basically describes the period during which, in the words of the famous medieval historian Richard Southern, during which the church was identified with the whole of organised society, and that starts to dissipate with the Reformation, and is definitively set aside with the French Revolution, so we'd call the period starting with the Reformation modernity. So antiquity, the Middle Ages, and modernity. And really, antiquity and modernity are defined for purposes of ecclesiastical history by the fact that they're not the Middle Ages. So whereas in secular terms, the Middle Ages was invented as a term, as an insult, focused on the wonderful pagan antiquity and the wonderful neo-pagan Renaissance, in reality, what we have is the central period in which the church was identified with the organized society, of the whole of organized society. And then we have a period leading up to that, during which the church became identified with the whole of organized society, from the Incarnation to Charlemagne, with obviously an intensification from the conversion of Constantine onwards. And then we have the period during which the church ceased to be identified with the whole of organised society from the Reformation until the present day. So that's our broad periodization. Now, the expression, or of course the doctrines that go under the umbrella of the social kingship of Christ are obviously as old as the church herself, otherwise they'd be false. But the practice of referring to them as the social kingship of Christ arises in reaction to modernity. Right, a particular kind of reaction to modernity that was characteristic of Leo XIII, and which was pursued by his successors up until the death of John the 23rd. And we'll talk about that when we talk about the challenges faced by those doctrines. So what happened there? Well, broadly, the identification of the church with the whole of organised society took place in 3 stages. The first stage was the conversion of the Roman Emperor Constantine in 312. He remained a catechumen for the rest of his life until a few hours, possibly before his death in 337. But from that point onwards, with the exception of 2 or 3 years under Julian the Apostate, the ruler of the Roman Empire was a Christian, or purported to be a Christian from that point onwards. The next stage, so the rulers were Christian. It was advantageous to be a Christian. The state accepted Christianity as a legitimate religious expression. It wasn't formally Christian yet. So that's from 312 onwards. The next stage is 380, when with the Emperor Theodosius, he issued an edict along with his co-emperors in the West, but it was his initiative, the Edict of Thessalonica in 380. And that edict said that the faith of the Pope, the faith of the Bishop of the Romans, the faith revealed by the divine apostle Peter to the Romans and today professed by the Pontiff Damasus and Peter of Alexandria, a man of apostolic holiness, who's the Patriarch of Alexandria. Alexandria was particularly prestigious at this time because they've been the heroic defenders of orthodoxy through the Arian crisis in the previous decades. And the decree expressly states that the true faith involves the profession of one God, who is Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and that only people who profess this Trinitarian faith and in general conform to the Pope and the Patriarch of Alexandria should be considered Catholics, or allowed to call themselves Catholics, and only they can call their gatherings churches. Everyone else who claims to be a Christian but doesn't conform to the See of Rome and the doctrine of the Trinity should be considered branded with the ignominious name of heretic, and their gatherings should be referred to as conventicles. The decree begins, "It is our will that all those who are subject to our mercy and clemency should continue in that faith which was revealed to by the divine apostle Peter to the Romans." So it doesn't, the implication is that it's not requiring conversion to Catholicism, but it is implicitly suggesting that there is some form of offence involved in discontinuing one's adherence to Catholicism. But the lineaments of that would become clear very slowly over many centuries. So this is the second stage, the formal adoption of Catholicism as the religion of the Roman Empire. So there are a number of developments of that over the intervening centuries, from the time of the Emperor Justinian in the 630s, sorry, I'm talking about the 530s, when he codified Roman law. It became increasingly more or less impossible to be a Roman citizen and not be a Christian. So Romanness and Christianness became quasi-convertible, and we'll probably talk about that a bit more at some point. But it noticeably in St. Patrick's letter to the followers of Caroctacus, if I'm getting the name right, as one of his 2 surviving writings, or definitely authentic surviving writings, there may be others. He refers to my fellow citizens, the Holy Romans. Very interesting phrase. So there's already a sense of the kind of sort of convertibility of Romanness and Christianness there. I mean, there's many other things, but it's just notable that someone living there beyond the classical Roman Empire you know, on the raggedy edge, as they say in Firefly, should still be using you know, talking in these terms. So but anyway, the third stage is essentially the coronation of the Emperor Charlemagne in the year 800. This is a huge watershed in Western history. It's a very complicated event in its effects. It broke up a kind of common worldview that the Eastern Romans, whose portion of the Roman Empire had survived, and the Latins in the West had up to that point held in common. There'd been a coup in the Eastern Roman Empire, which, as far as anyone was concerned at that time, was just the Roman Empire. So the worldview that Christians had in general at that time was that the temporal, they wouldn't have made this distinction precisely this way at this point, but anyway, but the temporal head of the Christian world was the emperor, and other legitimate Christian rulers were sort of franchisees from the emperor. This didn't mean that they actually really did what the emperor said, or could have their franchise revoked or whatever for not doing things the right way or anything like that. But they were entirely autonomous rulers. But the worldview was that there was a single community, a legitimate community on earth, whose center was the person and city of the emperor to some extent, and that other legitimate rulers were held their legitimacy from him. So famous expression of this given by some centuries earlier by Theodoric, who was an Ostrogothic king who'd taken over Italy, but again with a sort of imperial license. And he wrote to the emperor in Constantinople at that time, Anastasius, and he said, our monarchy is an imitation of yours, a copy of the only empire on earth. Right? So this kind of sums up this idea. There were exceptions to that, but they'd all more or less disappeared by Charlemagne's time. The Vandals in North Africa were Arians and didn't really buy into that theory. The Anglo-Saxons were godless pagans, but they eventually were converted, famously. So this theory would more or less was more or less universal by the late 8th century, but it was under a great deal of stress because all of mainland Western Europe that was not ruled by Muslims or pagans was by that point ruled by the Kingdom of the Franks. All these other realms had all disappeared. They'd all been annexed by the Franks or by the Muslims. And so, and in fact, the territory ruled by the King of the Franks was roughly equal to the territory ruled by the emperor in Constantinople. So the King of the Franks, who we call Charlemagne, Charles the Great, he was increasingly restless with the idea of his being nominally second fiddle to the emperor in Constantinople. And there are a number of signs of this Frankish restlessness building up until the year 800. But conveniently for Charlemagne, in 797, the emperor in Constantinople, Constantine VI, was deposed by his own mother in bizarre circumstances it would take a long time to describe. She had his eyes gouged out in the room where she gave birth to him. It's a classic Byzantine moment. And he died of his wounds, probably. And she probably was intending to set herself up as some sort of regent for her son, as she had been previously. But instead he died, and so she proclaimed herself the ruler in Constantinople, and even occasionally used the male version of the imperial title in Constantinople in order to try and give the impression that it was okay that she was a girl. Now, whatever one may think of the misogyny implied by this, Roman law did not permit women to hold office. So this provided a pretext for Westerners to refuse to accept the legitimacy of this Empress Irene as the head of the Roman world. And then in 799, due to another dispute, rather complicated one, again, Leo XIII, the Pope, was deposed, and also they attempted to gouge his eyes out, and by relatives of his predecessor who felt that somebody from their family ought to have attained the pontificate instead. And now this seems to have caused a general panic, because according to some systems of dating the world from its creation, the year 801, as we would enumerate it, would have been the year 6000 since the creation of the world. And that had been predicted by a number of even very early writers. I think it's in the Epistle of Diognetus in the 2nd century, and it's mentioned by Lactantius in the 4th century, and various other places. I think even Irenaeus of Lyon may allude to it in the 2nd century. This tradition that the Antichrist would appear in the 6000th year after the creation of the world. And due to some comments by St. Paul in the 2nd letter to the Thessalonians, there was a belief that the Roman emperor and the Roman Empire held back the coming of the Antichrist. But it's mentioned twice in, I think, chapter 2 of 2 Thessalonians, and on one occasion it's something which holds back the Antichrist, and on the other occasion it's someone that holds back the Antichrist. So it's specifically, at least on one of the references, the person of the Roman emperor. That's how the passage was interpreted anyway by the fathers, that was holding back the coming of the Antichrist. So, an alternative interpretation was already circulating by the 5th century, that's given some expression implicitly by Pope Leo I, who was Pope in the middle of the 5th century, in which it would be seen more as the Holy See rather than the Roman Emperor. So it was some great Roman power was holding back the coming of the Antichrist. It might be the Pope, might be the Roman Emperor, might be some subtle combination of the two, but whatever you thought it was, both of them appeared to have been deposed just in time for the date on which the Antichrist was supposed to appear. And so this sort of panic seems to have led to the idea of making the King of the Franks the Roman Emperor. And it was also a way of Leo III, who had escaped, according to hagiographical accounts, because his eyes were miraculously restored, and he was able to escape because his imprisoners thought that he was blind when he wasn't, he got across the Alps to the King of the Franks. The King of the Franks came back to Rome, reinstalled Leo, punished the people who tried to depose him, and then he was asked by a gathering of local notables in Rome, under the instigation of the Pope, to accept the title Roman Emperor, which he agreed to do. And he came to St. Peter's Basilica, the old St. Peter's Basilica, which was knocked down by Julius II in the 16th century, but was built by Constantine. He came to St. Peter's Basilica to attend Christmas morning Mass on Christmas morning 800 AD, which was at that time New Year's Day. So that would have actually been the morning of the year in which the Antichrist was supposed to appear. And he was crowned emperor by the Pope. Now it seems to me that something fishy happened at this coronation. Normally in Constantinople, the emperor would be acclaimed emperor in the outside the walls of Constantinople in a sort of parade ground, and he would then process through Constantinople to the cathedral, the Hagia Sophia, during which various ceremonies and receptions and recognitions of him by the different parts of Roman society would occur. And then he would be crowned emperor by the patriarch in the cathedral, the Hagia Sophia. But he was already very much the emperor by the time he was crowned, rather like with a modern British coronation, which occurs like a year and a half or something after the sovereign comes to the throne. This was not quite that long a period, but nevertheless, it was there was a clear separation of it, so that the coronation was a blessing on an accomplished fact. Now, with Charlemagne's coronation instead, the acclamation occurred in the church itself in St. Peter's. But I think so that the whole ceremony was telescoped. But at least my reading of it is that Charlemagne expected that he would be acclaimed by the Franks and the Romans in St. Peter's Basilica, and then the Pope would crown him. So it would be the same sort of ceremony as what happened over a day in Constantinople would happen over a number of minutes in the Basilica in St. Peter's. But that didn't happen. Instead, the Pope acclaimed him emperor himself, and immediately placed the crown on his head, and the people then responded by repeating the acclamation. So the impression was given that the Pope had made him emperor rather than simply blessed his elevation to the imperial office by the people. And Charlemagne, according to his biographer Einhard, and there's been endless argument over the centuries about what this means, but his biographer said that Charlemagne said that if he'd known what was going to happen that morning, he would never have entered the basilica. Now, some people have taken that as a sort of disingenuous humility topos, that he was saying, oh gosh, they made me emperor, how shocking. But we know that he knew several days beforehand that he'd been formally asked to accept the imperial title, so that doesn't really make any sense. So it seems to me that what he means by if he'd known what was going to happen is if he'd known that the acclamation and by the Pope and the people were going to be switched so as to give the impression that the Pope had made him emperor, he wouldn't have entered the basilica that morning. He never returned to Rome for the rest of his life. 14 years he lived, and he didn't go back to Rome. And he made a point of crowning his own son, Louis the Pious, emperor himself with his own hand, and got Louis to crown himself with his own hand, but none of it was good enough. The spectacular precedent of Christmas morning 800 was too powerful, and Louis went to Rome and got crowned by the Pope. And so this idea that somehow you can't really be emperor without the Pope's say so slowly embeds itself in the West, and eventually is expressed as a general principle when it's kind of rather had its day in political terms, if not theological and theoretical ones, in 1302 by Pope Boniface VIII in a bull that he gave, which is sort of one-page executive summary of the papal theory of how Christendom works. He says the spiritual power establishes the temporal power and judges it when it is not good. Right? So that kind of sums up the theory, which is elaborated out of the events of Christmas morning 800, but more fundamentally on very, very sound and correct theological foundations, most fullest expression in St. Augustine's City of God, which was written between the second and the third decade of the 5th century. So those are the three stages. The rulers become Christian. Christianity is a favored but not the official religion of the state. That's 312. The state itself, the Roman Empire, becomes formally Catholic, defining its adherence to the true religion by the doctrine of the Trinity and the teaching of the Roman Pontiff. That's 1380. Sorry, 380. And then the principle that the spiritual power establishes the temporal power and judges it when it is not good is established by the coronation of Charlemagne in 800. Now it takes a long time in all of those cases for the full ramifications of those events to unfold. You don't get popes actually deposing emperors until the 11th century, but the idea of the coronation of Charlemagne burned into the Western psyche in 800 is kind of very much the basis of that possibility by the time we get to the great powerful popes in the second half of the 11th century. So then the unraveling, so that's as it were the slow ending of antiquity, as we go through those three stages, and then we have this unraveling of Christendom, of the Middle Ages, starting with the Reformation. So the first stage of the unraveling would be the Peace of Augsburg in 1555. Now this was basically a sort of grudging truce between the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, or rather technically his brother, because he was just abdicating as it happened. He succeeded as Holy Roman Emperor by his brother. Charles V of the House of Habsburg had been struggling since 1521 to try and suppress the Reformation, and he looked like he'd got nearly to some success at various points, but it never really came through. And finally, in 1555, the House of Habsburg, of which he was the head, kind of threw up its arms and said, okay, Northern Germany can carry on being officially Protestant. So a heretical body inside Christendom was given a kind of quasi-permanent status by the Peace of Augsburg, and this was the first time that this had happened. But more terribly than that, this principle was encoded into the Peace of Augsburg, cuius regio eius religio, whose rule is the religion, which is sort of the reverse of what happened in 800. Because it said that you've got to follow the religion of the guy who's the temporal ruler where you are. Whereas the implication of what happened in 800 is that if the guy who's the temporal ruler defects from the true religion, then we're going to overthrow him. Or if the Pope declares that he has defected from the true religion, then he loses his office, and his people and his vassals can get rid of him, can and should get rid of him. So it's a complete reversal of that principle. So that's the first stage in the unraveling of Christendom. There's various occasions when it looks like it might be undone. Most importantly, the 30 Years' War, massive, brutal war in Germany between the Protestants, backed cynically by the French for their own geopolitical reasons, and the Catholics led by the Emperor from 1618 to 1648. And because of the French intervention, it ends in a stalemate, and the Peace of Westphalia in 1648 just reasserts the cuius regio eius religio principle of the Treaty of Augsburg. So that essentially means that the Reformation can't be undone, and it means that the place of the Pope as the kind of head of the Supreme Court of Christendom, as it were, is permanently undermined. I often say to seminarians in Denver, say, imagine that half the population of the US, including lots of officials and states and counties, decided they weren't going to recognize the Supreme Court anymore. They said that each man should just have his own copy of the Constitution in his pocket, and he should interpret it however the spirit of Thomas Jefferson directs him. And of course they're loyal to the Constitution, but not to any man's interpretation of the Constitution, no, to the true meaning of the Constitution, etc. Obviously, anarchy would ensue because the Constitution would become pointless and meaningless as a document for, I mean, of course, you could argue that it already is, because the Supreme Court makes up what it means as it goes along. But of course, because the Supreme Court isn't endowed with infallibility by God. Bracketing that problem, it would obviously destroy the United States of America as a polity if that happened. And that's essentially what happened to Christendom. And so it also meant that even those people who did recognize the definitive position of popes and ecumenical councils in regard to Christian teaching were doing so voluntarily, essentially, because they could easily just do a Henry VIII and cease to recognize the definitive authority of the Holy See in regards to Christian teaching. And the kings of France indeed sort of implicitly, permanently held this threat over the popes in order to control them in this period by invoking an error called Gallicanism, which essentially claimed that popes are only infallible when French people think they are. So the result was Christianity was completely undermined as the basis of public policy and public law, because there was no means of interpreting it clearly. And once it was clear that the Reformation couldn't be suppressed with the end of the 30 Years' War in stalemate in 1648, that unleashed the Enlightenment. So I was saying to a class in Denver of bewildered young people the other day that you see that the Reformation is the face hugger and the Enlightenment is the zoomorph bursting out of the chest of Western civilization. At least half of them got that anyway. So the Reformation, Enlightenment, boom. Right. So the Enlightenment is a movement to eliminate divine revelation as a principle of public policy and public law, because of course it makes no sense once you've eliminated any proximate norm of faith that's visible and public and can confirm or reject the interpretation of divine revelation. Then you've made divine revelation itself preposterous, and so naturally Western man is engulfed in a tide of secularization from the Peace of Westphalia onwards, and but this completely destroys the theoretical basis of the entire civil order. Although initially stupid hereditary monarchs think, yay, we don't have to do what the Pope says, we can just be totally unfettered, enlightened despots, and then they discover that actually this involves them and their family all being murdered by enraged mobs, and become less enthusiastic about the idea. But by then it's too late. So the French Revolution, 1789, which leads to massive war, which goes on until 1814-15. So this epoch, in that epoch, Christendom kind of comes down, crashing down in fire and blood as a result of the Enlightenment. Really climaxing with the what's called the Concorde Act of 1801 between the Pope Pius VII and Napoleon Bonaparte, who was at that time first consul dictator, essentially, of the French Republic, would make himself emperor 3 years later. He essentially said there'd been a persecution of the church, increasingly brutal, initiated by the French Revolution, at one point leading to the French government killing 350,000 of its own population for refusing to accept a sort of civil state church created by the revolutionaries. But at other points, actually having like sort of state atheism and then some weird deist cult of the supreme being. It oscillated wildly from one bizarre religious settlement to another, but all of them deeply hostile to the Catholic faith. At the end of that period, when Napoleon seized power, like a lot of dictators, they try and get sort of, try and offer goodies to the church in order to win for themselves a constituency in the opening years of their regime. This is the beginning of a trend in that direction that's unfortunately recurred many times in modernity. So Napoleon concludes this deal with Pope Pius VII, and it's assumed by the Holy See up until near the end of the negotiations that this deal is going to involve Catholicism being the religion of France again, and the hierarchy will be restored, and albeit they won't get their lands back, they'll get sort of a salary from the state as compensation. But then they switch at the last minute, and they say, we're not willing to have Catholicism be the official religion of France. We'll just say that as it happens, it's the religion of the consuls, and it's also the religion of the great majority of the French people. In fact, that's where the formulation contained in the original version of the Irish Constitution in 1937 probably comes from that. I would have thought, from the formulation used in the Concorde Act. But what essentially that is so cuius regio est, religio perishes in 1555. Then the Edict of Thessalonica that made Catholicism formally the religion of the civil order perishes in 1801 with the Concorde Act. Now, the third stage of unraveling, the return to direct persecution of people for being Christians, that's basically now. That's roughly where we've got to at this point. So, we're getting to the point where if you refuse to wear a rainbow badge at work, you get fired, and the courts don't back you up. So we're sort of, the transition into the illegalization of Christianity is we're in the middle of that, basically. So that's kind of where we are historically. Now, from the defeat of Napoleon 1814 to 15 until the accession of Leo XIII in 1878, there was a sort of a reaction, an attempt to restore Christendom But the problem was that the leading powers, after the defeat of the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Empire, only one of the leading powers was Catholic, the Austrians. The Russians were Orthodox. They were the greatest land power in Europe at the end of the Napoleonic Wars. The Prussians, who were an emerging second rank power in Germany, but would eventually take over Germany in 1870. They were Protestant. In fact, they were the original Protestant state, the first polity to convert to Lutheranism in the 1520s. The greatest global power was Britain, which was an official Protestant state in its Anglican, particularly notably preposterous formulation. So only the Austrians were actually Catholic. So although the Tsar of Russia, Alexander I, was extremely conservative, he was not and keen to restore Christendom. There was no common basis on which it could be restored. There was a pragmatic holy alliance between the Prussians, the Austrians, and the Russians, an agreement to suppress any resurgent revolutionary movements. But there was no, they didn't restore the Holy Roman Empire. And obviously they didn't recognize the final jurisdiction of the Pope, obviously. So essentially what you had was a kind of Disneyland plastic Christendom designed to put the lid back on the horrendous forces unleashed by the French Revolution, and it didn't work. Europeans were shifting to nationalism as an alternative source of civil legitimacy to the adherence to the true religion. And slowly nationalism had been ignored by the Congress of Vienna, the great international gathering that created the post-revolutionary order, particularly in regard to Germany and Italy. And as German and Italian nationalism asserted itself over the course of the 19th century, it caused the unraveling of the post-revolutionary settlement, until eventually the Papal States were eliminated by the Italian nationalists. The French had been backing up the Papal States, but they were unable to do so because they themselves were defeated by the German nationalists in the form of Prussia, which took over the rump of Germany and created the German Empire in 1871. So by the time Pope Leo XIII became Pope in 1878, the popes were the prisoners of the Vatican. They lived surrounded by a new nationalist Kingdom of Italy, which was highly anti-clerical, didn't recognize the sovereignty of the Holy See, had stolen 98% of all of its territory, didn't recognize its sovereignty over the tiny little bit that was left, which is essentially the modern Vatican City. So as soon as anyone was elected Pope from 1870 onwards, until 1929, when the sovereignty of Vatican City was recognized, they were stuck in Vatican City for the rest of their lives. But in 1870, just before the annexation of the Papal States, the Pope had been solemnly defined to be infallible. So the Gallican era at the First Vatican Council, the Gallican era, which the French kings had held over the popes as a means of controlling them before the French Revolution, was definitively destroyed by the solemn definitions of the First Vatican Council, which defined that the Pope is infallible and possesses ordinary universal jurisdiction over the whole church, which he may always exercise unimpaired. So basically that the Pope can govern any part of the church at any time, and that his authority trumps that of any other prelate. So he was kind of spiritually unchallengedly powerful in 1878 when he was elected Pope. Leo XIII, who's a local aristocrat from Lazio, he'd been a papal bureaucrat. And then latterly Bishop of Perugia, but he was completely civilly impotent because of the destruction of the Papal States. So Leo XIII essentially junked the Disneyland Christendom project of 1814 to 15, and he said that rather than trying to restore these hereditary monarchs who were always inclined to resist papal authority anyway, and at least in the latter centuries, and who also have not been very good at holding on to their thrones after they were restored to them. What we're going to do is we're going to lay out the ideal model of Christendom, taken in the abstract from Catholic teaching, and we're going to, which doesn't need to be on the basis of hereditary monarchy. It could be a republic or a confederation or an aristocratic republic or whatever, mixed monarchy or anything. Pretty much any civil arrangement is compatible with the Church's teaching concerning the proper ordering of the civil order. So we don't need to be beholden to the silk tights and the wigs. We can push the restoration of Christendom from scratch. And so he tried to do this by, well, I don't know, I forgot. Oh, I think aptly enough, my laptop is resting on top of this book. He tries to do this by means of his 9 great social encyclicals, which lay out, he called them the principal acts of our pontificate in a letter he wrote the year before he died, per Venuti, in 1902. So he laid out the ideal model of Christendom in these 9 encyclicals. In per Venuti, he lays out the order in which they ought to be read theoretically, which isn't the same as the chronological order. Aruca Press is going to republish the 9 encyclicals in 1 volume later this year. But this version I've got here is a version I got the library at the seminary to bind for me, but it's the famous Thomist philosopher in the 20th century, Etienne Gilson, French Thomist. He published them all in 1 volume with little introductions by him. That's this book, which he published on the title "The Church Speaks to the Modern World," which, as I say, is going to be republished this year. So the order of the encyclicals is on Christian philosophy, on human liberty, on Christian marriage, on Freemasonry, on civil government, on the Christian constitution of states, on socialism, on the rights and duties of capital and labor, and on Christian citizenship. So it's very much kind of like, it is like a manual or textbook, but magisterial, of Christendom. It's like, this is how to re-establish Christendom. If there's a nuclear war, take this with you and you'll be able to reconstruct Christian civil government using this book. That's essentially the idea. Now, in 1899, Leo XIII consecrated the human race to the Sacred Heart. Now, since the time of the 18th century, devotion to the Sacred Heart had been associated with resistance to Gallicanism and to the then popular heresy of Jansenism, and loyalty to the Holy See, and then particularly from the time of the French Revolution, loyalty to the order of Christendom against the new secularizing, militant, murderous forces of the Enlightenment. So there's this great focus on the Sacred Heart as a sort of token of eventual Christian victory in the temporal order. And so Leo XIII produced this wonderful formula of consecration. It's unbelievably politically incorrect, but I remember I heard it on its 100th anniversary. I happened to be wandering through Oxford at the time, and I popped into the Oxford Oratory, and just purely coincidentally, the Oratorian Fathers had the Blessed Sacrament exposed in highly solemn exposition, with a sanctuary full of candles, massive congregation, and just as I came in there, they were solemnly intoning the formula of consecration of the human race to the Sacred Heart to mark its 100th anniversary, and I'd never heard it before, and so I'll try and give it to you from memory. I apologize if there are any errors. But you'll see why I was quite taken aback by how unpolitically correct it was. Most sweet Jesus, Redeemer of the human race, look down upon us humbly prostrate before thine altar. We are thine, and thine we wish to be, but that we may be more surely united with thee, behold, each one of us most freely consecrates himself today to thy most sacred heart. Many indeed have never known thee, many too, despising thy precepts, have rejected thee. Have mercy on them all, most merciful Jesus, and draw them to thy sacred heart. Be King, O Lord, not only of the faithful who have never forsaken thee, but also the prodigal children who have abandoned thee, and call them back to their father's house, lest they die of wretchedness and hunger. Be king of those who are deceived by erroneous opinions, or whom discord keeps aloof, and bring them back to the harbour of truth and the unity of faith, so that soon there may be but one flock and one shepherd. Be king of those who sit still in the ancient superstition of the Gentiles, or in the darkness of Islam, and do not refuse to draw them out of darkness into the light and kingdom of God. Have mercy on that people once thine own. Of old they called down upon themselves the blood of the Saviour. May it now descend upon them as a laver of redemption and of life. Grant unto thy church assurance of freedom and immunity from harm. Give the tranquility of order to all nations, and make the earth resound from pole to pole with one cry. Praise to the divine heart that wrought our salvation. To it be glory and honour forever. Amen. So as you can see, yes, that's highly politically incorrect. I mean, I started listening to it and I thought, oh, that's nice. They're praying for all the lapsed Catholics. And then I thought, oh gosh, they're talking about the Protestants and the Orthodox. That's a bit aggressive. And then it was kind of, whoa, the Muslims, and then it was kind of, whoa, you can't say that about the Jews. We're going to be arrested. And yes, I was a bit taken aback. Yes, but of course, it's so the necessity, the universal necessity of adherence to our Lord Jesus Christ for salvation is absolutely fundamental to this doctrine, right? One doesn't pray for the conversion of the Muslims and the Jews, the Protestants, the Orthodox, because one doesn't like them. One prays for their conversion because one loves them and wants them to be saved from eternal damnation. But people seem to have lost sight of that. There's this idea that if you pretend that the person isn't drowning, that's more charitable than jumping into the sea in order to rescue them. So this consecration was in a way a kind of climax, spiritual climax of the 9 encyclicals which are contained in that book. The expression tranquility of order, it's often not translated that way if you see English translations, but that is exactly what it says in the Latin, and it's very important because it's the phrase that St. Augustine uses. It's a technical expression for the peace. It's his definition of peace, which obtains as a result of the correct ordering of all things, of man to God through Christ, and therefore of human society within itself, and of man's appetites within him. So the expression of the tranquility of order is very important because it's very much that's could be, would be a good title for this book. In fact, more exciting than the Church speaks to the modern world. But yeah, at least it's easy to get past people who are a bit resistant to traditional Catholic doctrine. They say, oh, it's called The Church Speaks to the Modern World. It can't be too harmful. So anyway, Pius XI in 1925, his intention was to codify, as it were, into a devotion, into a liturgical feast and a spirituality centered on the Sacred Heart, but specifically on our Lord as crowned ruler of all the nations, even in their temporal aspect, a doctrine which Leo greatly emphasizes in those encyclicals, also in the encyclical on the consecration itself, which is called Annum Sacrum, which Pius XI extensively quotes in his encyclical instituting the Feast of Christ the King, Quas Primas. And he required that formula of consecration be recited after the main Sunday Mass in every church and oratory on the Feast of Christ the King that he just instituted. So obviously modernity itself is simply liberalism is the ideology of modernity. Modernity is the period during which the church became separated, disidentified from the whole of organised society, and the doctrine of the kingship of Christ is all of those parts of Catholic teaching, as it were, codified into a single body of teachings directly opposed to liberalism and modernity. So liberalism is particularly well defined and condemned in the second of those encyclicals, Leo XIII, Libertas, a wonderful text. He gives 3 gradations of liberalism. The first is the full-on embracing of the ideology of modernity, which goes back to nominalism. It's an anti-Thomist movement in the late Middle Ages that rejected the tradition of Socrates and Plato and Aristotle and Augustine and Boethius that had climaxed in St. Thomas, rejects the idea that there are any natures to things. That says that the common nouns that we use to label the natures common to multiple individuals of the same type are mere names. They don't correspond to anything real in the thing themselves. And one of the consequences of that is it undermines the central plank of traditional accounts of political legitimacy, which is that man is a social and political animal, that by his nature he lives in society, and that being rational he needs a rule of teaching concerning what is to be done and what is to be avoided, which we call law, and therefore the need to be legislators to teach what is natural, and in the case of the ecclesiastical hierarchy, teach what is divine law, and to determine questions that are not specified by reason and divine revelation, like which side of the road you should drive on, and how many cents in the euro, and all that kind of thing. This is the traditional account of the origin of civil legitimacy, that nature, whose origin is in God, makes us social and political, and therefore the social and political authorities derive their authority from God, and that authority is also limited by divine and natural law. So if the civil authority tells you to do anything which is intrinsically immoral, contrary to the natural law, then they are to be ignored. If they try to force you, they are to be resisted. If they try to make you do anything contrary to divine law, they are to be ignored. If they try to force you, you're to submit yourself to martyrdom. If they try to do anything contrary to the public law which establishes them, then they are to be ignored and resisted, because the public law derives authority from the natural law, and so they're acting beyond their powers. So the traditional sense of the limitations on the origin of and the limitations on civil legitimacy, again brilliantly expanded by Leo XIII in those encyclicals, particularly Libertas and Diuturnum, derives from this idea of the common nature of man, and from that also is derived the idea that that man has that being a natural person, or sorry, not natural, but a natural juridical person, so that the civil order exists because God made nature in such a way that all human beings live in polities. And that means that those polities which will and know certain things, just like any corporation in law, you might decide that the Bank of Ireland is negligent in some respect, and some dissatisfied employee might sue the Bank of Ireland, and the Bank of Ireland will be treated in court as if it were a person. So as it were, the court of divine justice, a polity, the Republic of Ireland, the United Kingdom, the United States of America, the Federal Republic of Germany, etc., they are persons, juridical persons in divine justice, and they have obligations to God in natural law, in the same way that McDonald's Corporation or the Transport and General Workers Union or the Republic of Ireland might have obligations in international law or civil law. So, and those obligations include all of the Ten Commandments. So they are obliged to worship the one true God in the manner he has appointed. So nominalism destroys this by saying that there is no human nature, therefore legitimacy can't be derived from that human nature. Therefore, man is in fact the author of the legitimacy of the civil power. It's created through a social contract, as it eventually gets called. They agree, human beings belong to a particular state because they've agreed in advance through this social contract to submit themselves to whatever that state may do. And so that removes all those limitations. The state is no longer limited by morality, divine revelation, or even, in some sense, its own public law. The supreme sovereign power in that state is omnipotent, what Thomas Hobbes called the Leviathan, the ravenous beast that none can resist upon the earth. and this is what the modern state is essentially, and it has no obligations to anybody other than itself, because there's no legal order outside of the will of the Leviathan itself which constrains the Leviathan. And so that's ultimately where the most extreme pure form of liberalism comes from. That's the ideology of the modern state. And that's principally what the social kingship of Christ is directed against, this idolatrous state that worships itself and believes itself to be free of all moral and revealed law. There are then two mitigated forms of liberalism by which are not logically coherent in themselves, but by which people who are unwilling to accept to burn incense directly in front of the Leviathan are slowly lured into its clutches. One of the mitigated forms is a sort of quasi-deist idea that there is a natural law, but there isn't a divine law. They reject miracles and divine revelation. They say there is morality, it's knowable by natural reason, but particular religious forms are just ways, convenient ways of expressing this natural religion. They don't have any certainty. They weren't really revealed by God. There are no real miracles to back them up, or prophecies or whatever. So this doesn't make sense, because because of the nature of God as knowable by natural reason, we know that we can't worship him without him telling us how to worship him, but we know we have an obligation to worship him. So in order to get out of that obligation, you have to undermine theism, our knowledge of God through reason, and it ends up becoming a kind of deism, which is a sort of monotheistic paganism, which is itself incoherent. You can't explain its compatibility with human suffering. So eventually it collapses back into the full-on aggressive Leviathan, all-conquering ideological liberalism of the highest form of liberalism. The other mitigated form is one that accepts that there is a natural law, and divine revelation, but the divine revelation is exclusively for families and individuals, not for the state, right? And so that's very popular among more conservative people in the United States. It's also ultimately incoherent, because if God hasn't established, well, because we know that man is a social animal and political animal from his own nature, therefore we can't get out of him having these obligations as a society to God. And also, if there is no public authority by which divine revelation can be the principle of public policy and public law, then there can't really be any divine revelation, because God would not reveal his will to the world and the means of salvation and then forget to include in the package a means of certainly knowing what the content of that divine revelation is. So that again collapses back into the extreme form of liberalism. And so that's what we see essentially in the church today and in the world, is that there are those who fight for the kingship of Christ, those who uphold the public verifiable nature of the faith, such that it could function as a principle of public policy and public law. And opposed to them are the theological and political liberals, who are always turning back into totalitarian liberals. They essentially want us to buy an ideology that man is naturally solitary and has no nature. Thus, he can change himself from a man to a woman, or whatever it is he is, whatever he identifies as. It's kind of radical nominalism, which is really an ideology to back up the omnipotence of the Leviathan state. Their fifth columnists inside the church want to alter the nature of the faith to be a subjective religious feeling, what we call modernism, so that it doesn't matter that it is impossible to verify. So they want to render the faith, theological liberalism wants to render the faith permanently inapt to function as the principle of public policy and public law, and political liberalism wants to eliminate divine revelation entirely from secular society, exclude it completely as a principle of public policy and public law, and also thereby destroy human nature in order to avoid human nature reasserting itself and going back towards Christianity. So that is the battle in which we're involved. That is what the social kingship of Christ is, and that has been its history over the last 2,000 years, all in 1 hour and 4 minutes. Sorry about that.
Oh, Alan, that's brilliant. Thanks a million. It was an impossible task I set you, and you've done it. Fair play. No, it really was a great talk. I know you have to shoot off now pretty soon.
Well, I'm okay.
Just a few minutes for Q&As.
I've got definitely half an hour or so, and then
Fantastic. So, guys, if you have any questions, work away. any questions that popped up in your mind during the talk, then now is the time.
Well, I have a big one. So how would you think that we would fight back against the liberalism that's swamping us?
Well, as I said, that tranquility of order is express itself on all of these different levels, you know, within the family, within the individual himself, within society, within temporal society, and within the church. So I know this sounds trite, but really the first stage is to pray the rosary every day, go to confession once a week, and make good communions as often as possible. Well, obviously don't ever make bad ones, but make good ones as often as possible. The second stage is to get a 365-day Bible and read it every day in a good translation of Scripture, and to steep oneself in the writings of the Fathers of the Church in order to interpret it correctly, and in the definitive teachings of the Magisterium. And then on the specific point, I recommend getting hold of this book. You can't, because it's, well, you could probably write to the library at my seminary, but it'd be very expensive to post it to you. But they're all online, and as I say, they're going to be republished by Aruka Press sometime this year. So the next stage will be to propagate that teaching. Right, because one of the big problems is that people just don't know it. Almost no Catholics know this teaching, so I mean, bishops talk constantly as if at least the second of the two mitigated forms of liberalism described by Leo XIII in Libertas were true, and clerics, and they're always behaving this way. So in fact, of all the encyclicals in here, the one that covers all the bases most, that like includes the teaching of the other encyclicals, at least on these questions, not so much on economics, but on other things, is Libertas. So if you're going to put any encyclical in someone's hands out of those 9, put Libertas in their hands. Probably I go to find a Catholic church where the priest teaches Orthodox doctrine and celebrates the Mass in accordance with the laws and tradition of the church, and go there and only go there, and find a good religious community or something along those lines to give money to, right? Because I remember the former president of the Society for the Protection of Unborn Children, John Smeaton. I heard him give this wonderful talk once, and he was saying, people often complain to me about that I keep banging on about internal Catholic politics. He says, but I'm supposed to be the president of a pro-life organization, and he says, but the problem is that there's 1.2 billion Catholics. They're all supposed to be pro-life. It's the largest pro-life organization in the world, obviously, by definition. It's the largest pro-life organization, obviously. It's not a pro-life organization in the sense that's the only thing it does, but it's the largest pro-life organization in the world. He says, if we lose the Catholic Church, I mean, it's all over. You're saying so. I mean, not that we're pursuing this isolated objective. I mean, us, but of course he was the head of the Society of Protection of Unborn Children, so he was. But so avoiding liberal clergy and liberal teaching is incredibly important, because it's not like the early church, unfortunately, where anyone who was a notorious public sinner or a heretic was excommunicated by return of post, and the faithful elected their own bishops. Since the 19th century, we've been living in a highly bureaucratized and centralized version of the church, in which if the Congregation for Bishops goes bad, everything underneath it goes bad. So the only way in which we can do anything about that is by voting with our feet I don't mean becoming Methodists. I mean voting with our feet, by only going to those churches where the priest preaches the true faith and administers the sacraments in accordance with the teaching of and the tradition and the law of the church. Right? That's terribly, terribly important, because eventually pure demography and the realities of bookkeeping will kill off the liberal clergy, right? But it'll take a while. But it's the only instrument that the laity have in their hands in these days to try and.
Because I do think there is a lot of priests out there that, rather than being Catholic, preach a moralistic, therapeutic deism.
Oh yes, absolutely.
It drives me crazy. Like, oh, I'm a good person. I haven't killed anyone, and God is good and God loves everybody. So if I don't murder anyone and live my best life,
my best life,
when I die, I'll go to heaven because God's good, and you're kind of going. For me, myself, actually, when you say that, it was in and around the time of the abortion campaign in Ireland.
Yeah.
I actually started what I would call church hopping. I was like a Protestant.
Yeah. Dear.
And
Don't do that.
And as I came across the local priest, and I was going, "Oh no, you're a bit of."
You were hopping Catholic churches. You weren't. Right. Yes. Right.
I have a friend who's a Franciscan, and he says there's an awful lot of priests out there, and he says they're what he would call Cathistants. They're Catholic Protestants, really. And I literally spotted that in the churches as I was going around Galway, and I went, "I'm not going to you. You're just too welcoming." And God loves it. Like, don't get me wrong. We know God loves everyone, and a church should be welcoming.
Yes.
But when it comes to something like this, it should be a hardline issue. When you've priests who don't even take abortion as a hardline issue,
Well, yeah, it's like when I was saying about the drowning man. The person who jumps in and tries to pull the drowning man out of the water is the one who loves the drowning man, not the guy who stands on the edge of the water theorizing about how he might not really be drowning, and he might be anonymously not drowning. It's just that we can't see him.
As someone who
can we start? Whoa. That's great for one question.
Sorry.
Could we? Anyone else have a question? I know that's brilliant question.
Yeah.
Thanks, Kelly. Anyone else have a question? Just so we get everyone covered if they want. Now is your time.
Yeah.
Hello.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Harry. Go ahead.
Yeah. You can't hear me, no?
No,
Yeah,
I can.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. Okay. No, Alan, I just wanted to ask, why was Pope Leo XIII never canonized? He also wrote some wonderful encyclicals on 13 of them, I think, on the Rosary alone, or maybe apostolic letters. But he's forgotten to all intents and purposes. We have Pope St. Paul VI, we've John the 23rd, John Paul II, great man, but his case or his cause, and of course Pius X after him was canonized, but his case, I think he's just completely head and shoulders above a lot of his people that came after him.
Well, I think in the old days, people got canonized because you put them in the ground, and the next day the blind started to see and the lame started to walk, and people rose from the dead, and so people were in no doubt. The traditional Saint Therese method of being canonized, and people. And of course, when you canonize somebody, the formula of canonization itself only involves the direct assertion that at the point at which the Pope pronounces it, that person has the beatific vision. So they could have been in purgatory from the moment of their death until the point at which they were canonized. And in fact, it's not impossible that canonization could work as a kind of plenary indulgence on steroids. So the person might have actually been in purgatory, but for the formula of canonization, right? So all we know through canonization is that the person wasn't damned, and that from the moment that they were canonized, they were in heaven.
Right.
And in some of these more recent canonizations, they slimmed down the number of miracles required and actually dispensed from them altogether in the case of some of the recent canonizations. Now Now that is again part of this kind of centralized bureaucratic model of the church, whereas of course, you know, back in the first millennium it was to do with miracles happening at your tomb, and you were kind of canonized by popular acclaim, and then it was kind of regularized by the papal process of canonization in the second millennium, but that's become that's become more and more centralized to the point of people being canonized when there's no miracles evidenced at all. I personally hold that canonizations are infallible, so I'm not attempting to doubt the legitimacy of the canonizations of these people that you're referring to, but I just saying that then they're not arising spontaneously from the population in the same sort of way. Of course, that's not true of John Paul II. His canonization was obviously extremely widely sought. So when Leo XIII died, there'd been no canonized pope since Pius V back in the 16th century. And there's no canonized pope before him, unless you count Celestine V, who abdicated. There's no canonized pope before him till you get to Gregory VII, and he wasn't canonized until the 18th century. So there are a number of blesseds, but people did not assume that popes would be canonized. Catholics were much better formed. They had a sense that, you know, a successful clerical career isn't necessarily the best way of attaining to sanctity or salvation. So there wasn't a default assumption that you were going to canonize a pope, and that if you didn't, there was a bit of a cloud over his pontificate. And then immediately following him, Pius X was this sort of volcano of sanctity, who was canonized, you know, by the standards of those days very rapidly thereafter. So it's not until they start canonizing people almost by default after Vatican II that the idea of, ooh, why wasn't this guy canonized, started to occur to people. Because people would want when a pope canonized somebody, they'd want really that person to have not gone to purgatory, because they want them to be ideally a perfect moral exemplar for the faithful. So that's what all the kind of investigations and stuff surrounding canonizations are for. They're there to make sure it's a good model. But just the second half of your question, I think Leo was a huge figure up until Vatican II. After Vatican II, people talked about him, gave him lip service as someone who was more open to the modern world, which of course is ironic, because meaning that he wasn't enthusiastic about Disneyland Christendom, but he was extremely viciously and highly elaborately hostile to modernity. So you'll get people talking, they'll talk about Leo XIII, they'll drop his name, but they'll not be keen on you reading his documents. I mean, like they'll say, oh, he started Catholic scriptural scholarship, but they'll desperately not want you to read his encyclical on the subject, Providentissimus Deus, which causes modern biblical critics to have heart palpitations. So yeah, he's become this kind of nominal figure who is sort of his name is waved about as someone who perhaps paved the way for post-conciliar neo-modernism, but they never want you to read the documents, so they don't talk about him too much in case someone actually Googles his texts.
We can pray for his canonization to happen
sure.
before Pope Francis is canonized anyway. So listen, any other short quick questions there? Alan doesn't have much more time, so quick question please.
Thanks, Alan, for that whirlwind tour. Really.
Sorry, yes.
I've been, reading this Rod Dreher's new book, "Live Not by Lies," a manual for Christian dissidents. But it's interesting because he was talking to Soviet survivors, the elderly people living in the United States now, and they could see kind of signs of soft totalitarianism that they witnessed in the Soviet Union, kind of growing in the States. And would you subscribe to kind of Dreher's thing that we kind of need to be preparing for, I suppose, more in terms of what's happening to Christians on the periphery, in terms of now there's a lot of persecution of Christians, but maybe in years to come that's going to come a lot closer to home. And as Dreher is quite, I suppose, sounding the alarm in the sense that we need to kind of prepare for persecution.
Well, I think on the one hand, he's right that rather like I was saying about finding a church where they preach the gospel and administer the sacraments in accordance to the law and tradition of the church, we need to kind of circle the wagons, right? Because we're in a terrible situation at the moment. So we need to find a defensible position from which we can form up the remaining troops and start to think about some kind of reversal. But I mean, it's like if it's ever going to be reversed, it's an extremely long-term fight. So in that sense, yeah, we need to find some kind of defensible position and that we can stand on. And but on the other hand, I think he seems to be kind of giving in on a meta level to liberalism, in the sense that he's not saying that the purpose of finding this position is to reassemble our forces, build them back up again, go back into battle and reclaim and win the war. He seems to be like, the idea is to, like, you know, find an obscure valley in the mountains where we'll be left alone. Right. So I don't think that is, I think there's two problems with that. One is it's not going to work. There'll just be a brutal massacre of everyone living in that valley after a short period where it looked a bit nicer. And the other reason is because we're not, our Lord doesn't give us that option, right? He says, go and make disciples of all nations, right? And he says to Ananias, the guy who receives St. Paul, but the blind St. Paul, and he says, he is my vessel of election to preach, he says the word of salvation or something, to the Gentiles and their kings, right? So it's very specific that from the beginning we are sent to convert entire cultures. We're not sent to, and the civil order, the rulers themselves, we're not sent only to, and we can't only preach the gospel to individuals and families, because man is a social and political animal. So if you're not preaching to him qua political animal, you're not truly preaching to him, if that makes sense. So it's much less important whether or not we succeed in converting our entire nation or whatever it is, than that we try. Because if we're not trying, then we're not really preaching the gospel. And we've seen that since the council, that people have, I mean, it's not the case that the council teaches that we should abandon this mission, but it's certainly, the impression was given, and partly intentionally by some of the more nasty of the council fathers, deliberately given, and it's been very successfully given, that we have abandoned it. And the result of that isn't the emancipation of the faith from the shackles of the Constantinian era and all this guff that people were talking about. The result has been the collapse of the church's mission to the world. I mean, if you look at, the church has been beleaguered in Western cultures and made up the numbers in colonial territories since the 17th century, until the election of Leo XIII, and his turning round of the project to abandon Baroque Christendom in favor of vigorous scholastic Christendom, which is what he was trying to do, was unbelievably successful. If you look at the revival of seminaries, religious orders, conversions, decline in lapsation, the position that the church achieved between 1878 and 1958 was unbelievable. I mean, the church in the United States trebled, I believe, just in the pontificate of Pius XII. Right, so the awful thing about the rise of neo-modernism in the 60s is that we were on the verge of becoming the majority religion in the hegemonic power in the world, at the point at which we trashed it all. So we were in a terrible situation in 1878. It wasn't as bad as the situation we're in now, but it was pretty bad. And that's essentially what Leo XIII did. He formed up the ranks in a defensible position, drilled them, and then sent them back into battle. And that's what prevailed until we threw away the strategy. So yeah, I think that's the problem with his strategy, is that he's got the tactics right, but the strategy is completely wrong. And in terms of how bad things are going to get, I mean, it's pretty bad. I was in just a couple of years ago. We were going off to visit a cousin of mine, me and my sister and her husband and my wife and our kids, and they live in Edinburgh, near Edinburgh Airport, and we went to hire a car because we'd come over from the States and we didn't have a car. From the car hire place one of them next to Edinburgh Airport, and my brother-in-law gets really nervous about this sort of thing because he lives in the People's Republic of Sturgeonia, previously known as Scotland, so the danger of him getting into trouble for being insufficient woke is always looming. And we went into this car hire place, and the guy behind the counter, in fact, everybody there wearing these little rainbow badges. And I was just like, oh, how irritating, and I didn't pay any attention to it. But he was so depressed when we got back in the car, because he said, basically, that guy, we've no idea what that guy thinks. If he'd come into work and refused to wear that badge, he would have got fired, and no court would have supported him. Or at least it's a 50-50 chance in 2018 or whatever that was, and it's probably a 25% chance that he would have been backed by the courts today, and it will be a 10% chance next year. So I mean, it's getting closer, and it's because we've retreated from all these positions. If you ask for the total conformity of the civil order to the kingship of Christ, you will at least get a benignly neutral civil order. Right. If you ask for a benignly neutral civil order, you will get wear your rainbow badge or be fired. Right. And if you agree to wear the rainbow badge, you'll be taken out and shot 10 years later. Right. So I mean, it's the less you ask for, the less you get.
Thank you so much for joining us today from Denver.
Oh, thank you.
Listen, it'd be great if we did something here, maybe started a little study group, 2 or 3 of us studying Pope Leo's encyclical, even if it was online via Skype. That'd be great.
Well,
Studying Libertas, it'd be fantastic. So just for an idea out there to the group of us here in Ireland, we could do something like that.
I'm doing a course with the lay division here that's on Zoom because of COVID on the 9 encyclicals of Leo XIII, and I do think that's just a one-off, and we're like more than halfway through it. But I mean, I think that trying to get people to study those encyclicals electronically as broadly as possible across the world in lots of locations, I think is an incredibly profitable thing that we should be.
Please God, we'll do that.
Thanks, Alan.
Thanks, Alan.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.